Okay, look, I'm conscious that we are, I know there are some people that are watching this, so just remember that we are on live stream, so welcome to those that are. Oh, look, I am echoing, yes. It's not a good thing. So, welcome to our Three Waters Reform Community Workshop. And I'm going to hand this over to the Chief Executive, who's going to bring us up to date of where we're at and the future in terms of the Better Off funding proposition.
Thank you, Mayor Burney. And I'm conscious that we're already kind of behind time. And this workshop item itself could take a long time. And so what I want to continue with, what I'm going to end with, is that this is a big topic, and this is probably the start of a lot of conversations that council are going to have over the next few weeks and months, as we A, prepare an application for the Better Off funding, but B, prepare our organisation and community for transition. So tonight I'm going to go over the status of the reform. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Water Services Bill, the Rural Supplies Technical Working Group. I'm going to talk about Better Off funding. I'm going to talk about the National Transition Unit, and some early kind of thoughts around our approach to transition. So we will all hold personal opinions around this reform program, and clearly this council has an opinion around the reform program, and I think that that's been made really clear in the submissions that this council has made to government, your membership of Communities for Local Democracy, but right now we're in a position where the reform has a green light, and obviously my role is to help support council through the transition of that green light, regardless of kind of our feelings and emotions that sit around that green light. The Water Services Bill is in the House already. It's had its first reading. The government is not mucking around and progressing on this reform program. That bill is the first part of a suite of legislation. The first bill provides for the establishment of the water entities. It sets out the representation, the governance, the accountability arrangements, all of which are the recommendations that came from that governance and accountability working group, which the Minister established late last year in an attempt to resolve the challenges that the local government sector pretty broadly were raising with the government. There are some, the water bill has picked up on the recommendations of that working group, in particular around emphasising the protection against privatisation, the clarity around community ownership, and while I know many of us won't think it's gone far enough, but there has been attempts to give it a stronger community voice within the new entities. This bill does not transfer the assets and liabilities. That is to come in the second bill, which I understand is going to be introduced into the House by November. And that bill will cover the things like the regulatory system, how resource management, how the economic regulator, which is obviously really important because that's all about pricing, but also how as consumers there'll be appropriate protection.
Can I just ask, Monique, in relation to the first bill, do you understand, do you have any indication of when that's likely to, what the travel time for that is? Like, when is that likely to have its...
Well, I understand that its third reading will be parallel to the first reading of the second bill. So before the end of this year, I think it will be interesting to see how the Finance Select Committee, which are obviously hearing the submissions to this bill, how they see that time frame rolling out in light of local body elections. So just kind of I'll be really clear, I have not read the bill. I've read parts of the bill, but I have not read the bill in full. That's kind of a summary of the bill. Councils are allocated shares in the entity. One share equals 50,000 people, so obviously as a council we won't have one share, we'll have point something of a share. Each entity will have two. Yes, sorry, you're right. We won't have, but the proportion doesn't necessarily mean we then are reflected in the same way smaller communities. So I think the point I was trying to make is that the share allocation doesn't necessarily reflect the concerns that people raise during that process. That it doesn't equal numbers. This is an attempt to try and give the smaller councils a voice. Each entity will have two levels of governance, so there'll be the competency-based board, and then there'll be the regional representative group, which is made up of council and mana whenua. The bill goes to some length in giving assurances around the protection about the loss of public ownership, things around equity and security, divesting of ownership, and any divestment proposal requires unanimous support from the council owners. The bill provides for the transitional arrangements, so that is essentially the transition of the water services from council to the new entities. So it gives those entities power in developing the strategic direction, establishing a lot of the planning and reporting requirements, but it also gives power around the employment of people into the entity.
Thanks, Monique. I just wondered, we've just done our representation remuneration today. Has there been any consideration that you're aware of around the fact that this will be another layer of work for councillors added onto their existing roles, to whether they're considering that that's a position of responsibility with remuneration on those boards?
So I don't think it's intended that elected members would sit on any of those boards. And so in fact, the dialogue that I've heard. Yeah, that's not necessarily elected members.
Specifically says in the bill that elected members are not part of any of those bodies.
Yeah, so if anything, the dialogue has been about remuneration of elected members, reflecting no longer being responsible for the delivery of Three Waters.
So i.e. no local accountability for decision making.
Yes, Councillor Jennings. Yeah. Which is obviously one of the, like if we go back to some of the rationale of the reform program, is around under Taumata Arawai, the regulatory body, where there's obviously a whole lot of more culpability around the delivery of drinking water, so that accountability is kind of matched with culpability.
Again, about the that two levels of governance, the competence board first, I assume they're appointed, not elected, and then that regional representation group is potentially elected, but not of the current elected body or system we have. And you mentioned Māori on that tier. Yeah, I think those that are following this are thinking that they're in the top tier, but clearly not.
No, so and I don't have the paperwork on me, but it talks about, like, obviously the board is appointed by the regional representative group. So I suppose the idea that is followed is that because the regional representative group will be, a partnership between council representative and mana whenua representative, that there is an assumption being made that that would mean that at a board level there would be some form of, that it was a competency-based board. The minister initially came out with a 50-50 competency-based board, and the working group made some recommendations, and when the government made their final announcement, you might remember that Minister Robertson fronted that, and that was kind of the headline in the local government sector that had kind of been ignored.
Yeah, thanks for that. I just, I guess the original sale point for Māori, just say it that they thought that they were around the other way, but clearly not. So it's not a sweet deal, really. And I knew that all along, but I just think some of them have been deceived into thinking that this is ideal.
So the legislation provides employment security for council's current three water employees, where assurances have been given around their employment positions into a new entity, but noting that isn't for management positions, it's for positions below that. And then, as I said earlier, the bill obviously doesn't do the transfer of the assets or the liabilities. That is in the legislation that will follow. So the Finance and Expenditure Select Committee opened for submissions on the 10th of June, and submissions close on the 22nd of July, with the view there, kind of to your question earlier, Councillor Jennings, about completing the remaining legislative stages shortly thereafter. It's 2022 calendar year. This is a sprint. So, one of the things that we're seeking guidance from you today is, do you want Horowhenua District Council to make a submission, kind of acknowledging the scale of technical expertise that sits within the bill? Are you comfortable, if you do want us to make a submission, are you comfortable that we piggyback of LGNZ, Communities for Local Democracy and Taitoa? And so what I mean by that is kind of pulling out the good bits of their submission and capturing in that submission. Are we safe to use the submission from 2021 as the starting point to our submission? So picking up those key themes around local voice, accountability, or for those of you who have read the Water Services Bill, are there key elements when you read it that, or in kind of your reading of the summary of the bill, that you're particularly keen to give us some guidance on so that we can capture that? And then, how do you want community to be informed of that submission process, recognising that we literally have a month to prepare a draft submission, and I think that probably what I would just caution council on is we could make a submission about everything, but the Finance and Expenditure Select Committee, their scope is to the bill, so it's a very narrow scope that they have the ability to move on, which has always been the criticism of local government, is we wanted to have this conversation pre-bill, not while we're in the bill process. And so I suppose I provide that guidance because we could spend a lot of time on a submission that shares all our thoughts and feelings, but it might not actually influence anything. Our submission really needs to look to influence elements of the bill we're concerned about. So maybe if I just pause there for a couple of minutes to hear some feedback and discussion, and then I'm going to move on to talk about some other things.
So just by way of feedback, for me it's not about reinventing the wheel in terms of work we've already done. Our submission was quite detailed, the one in 2021, and the more I see Communities for Local Democracy, what they are doing, the more I admire that group, and I'm really pleased that we're part of it, because they've not only opposed, but they have proposed some very good, clear alternatives. So I think, and so let's minimise the work for the organisation, because so much of it has already been done, and it's a matter for me about pulling out those key points around accountability and democracy from Community for Local democracies, reiterating our total support for them. And in terms of connecting with the community, I think there's a really good job for the comms team to make sure that we message them in a very concise way. It's not about the level of detail, but it's just about our stance, our unwavering stance around local democracy and accountability. Some really clear statements to the community through social media and the news media as appropriate. So those are my thoughts.
Yeah, Monique, share Councillor Allen's comments. I think that we need to be very firm in our opposition through that process, but as you say, with a targeted and logical submission. And so the question for me would be, how do we get some assurance, or how do we get some insight from Communities for Local Democracy around what their submission might look like, and so whether we're going to piggyback off them or whether we're doing our own standalone. So I don't know whether we could set up some dialogue with them to understand at what point they think they're going to have a reasonably advanced draft submission where we could potentially look at that, consider that, and decide whether to essentially use that or perhaps then borrow some of the contents of that and prepare our own response. Just on the elements of the Water Services Bill, the share structure in particular is a nonsense in my view. And so, for example, we as a council with a population of 36,000 population get one share. The Chatham Islands Council, with a population of 700 people, also gets one share. It's an absolute nonsense, and so for me, that's one that sort of tokenism in terms of that approach needs a forceful response. And also share Councillor Allen's comments about the public, the comms, and making sure that we take people along for the journey around this. I think that's really, really important.
That's really helpful. Thank you, Councillor Jennings. I have reached out to LGNZ and Communities for Local Democracy, and I understand a draft is going to come this week, if not early next week. In Tautauora, obviously, I sit on the board, and so we're supposed to see a draft tomorrow. So we hopefully will be in a position where we can use other people's work.
Thanks, Monique. I'm just wondering, last week at Rural and Provincial, the Mayor for Opotiki spoke to the fact that the iwi in the area had supported their original submission letter, the one we earlier sent in 2021. So I wonder if that's something we could aspire to, as having Ngāti Rako and Moapopo sit alongside us with the submission.
Look, we can certainly do that, but that is going to require some effort from the elected member table because we're in a short period of time. Councillor Isaacs?
Yeah, I'd just like to support pretty much everything that Councillor Allen said. I'm in total agreement with everything he said, and just to give you some feedback, that's where I'm sitting.
Cool, that's helpful. Anyone kind of have a departing view from what's already been?
Yeah,
Yeah, Robert was just saying total board.
Yeah, about the, I guess, in terms of our partnerships with local iwi and sort of the engagement we currently have with them, i.e. those monthly raukaua meetings, etc. I have to say, not all of them are up to speed with the process to even date that this reform the government's been going through. They keep telling this story about we're engaging with Māori, we're talking to iwi leaders. Well, actually, it's lacking, massive. And so now that it's the first readings being done, there would be a lot of catching up to do that they need, but it's actually quite getting to a critical point where this massive change, like we've just local government wide decided whether or not to establish a Māori ward and have them sit at the table. And for most of us, we've taken that on board. And now, when they've actually got a chance to be at the decision-making table around Three Waters, it's now taken away over here. So the thing that's most important to them is now not even part of the decisions that they'll make going on in the future. It just frustrates me. And while I think if they knew what we knew about local voice, accountability, the risk around privatisation of their most precious, resource, they'd be right alongside us. Like you said, Joe, they'd have a supporting letter, but they're just, it's a shame that there's not enough time because the 22nd of July is around the corner. But so I think critical is that last one about how we inform community, including them, and getting those really those main points across, what the impact or the implication of this actually means on the ground, what it looks like, and how they'll be left out yet again in a I guess a bigger way actually, and not us. How do you address that?
So what I'm hearing, Councillor Tokopara, is making sure that as we kind of talk to them about the submission process, we try to use it as an opportunity to share some of the intel we have, but also that our submission reflects our concern around not only what it does to take away community voice, but also take away hapu and iwi engagement.
Yes, because those four entities now, when we're caught between Blenheim and Gisborne, and all those iwi and hapu in between, there's no way two iwi here that haven't even got their treaty settlement are going to be at that table.
Okay, I'm going to move on.
Can I just, one last thing, Monique? There's a document that's been prepared by the Ministry of Justice around compliance of the bill with the Bill of Rights Act. And one of the things that it assesses is whether the proposed legislative language creates preferential or differential treatment of different races. And they've concluded that it hasn't, but there's some useful analysis in there around some of those, I guess, some aspects of the bill around those provisions that essentially grant Māori certain powers or rights in terms of the governance. And so it's worthwhile probably just having a look at that in terms of the preparation of our submission.
Can you send that to us? Thanks. So I just want to quickly touch on the Rural Supplies Technical Working Group, which they were established to provide the government advice around what the whole regulation and reform program meant for rural suppliers. And you might remember that there was a point in time where there was real concern about what did this mean in terms of the ongoing ownership of rural water supplies. So they presented their work start of June, and it made 30 recommendations. I think probably the key point is that the private rural supplies are unaffected by service delivery reform. So Mr. and Mrs. A farm owner who has a rural sort of water supply, so they're providing water to more than one property. That's the definition of a rural water supply. They are unaffected by the service delivery reform. But let's say council owned a rural water supply, or we might part own a rural water supply, which I understand we don't. But there are some councils around New Zealand that obviously have a lot of these. They would be affected by service delivery reform, where that would go over to the new entity. And I don't expect you to read all of this, but even though those rural water supplies are not affected by the service delivery reform, they are affected by the regulatory reform. So by November 2025, there are approximately 75,000 small drinking water suppliers in New Zealand, and what I've heard is that 75,000 is pretty conservative. That must be registered, and they will have 7 years to provide drinking water safety plans for them or to adopt an acceptable solution. And so the recommendations from the Rural Water Supply Working Group is they make a whole lot of recommendations in an attempt to essentially lower the bar, because based on the current regulations under Taumata Arawai and the legislation which gave Taumata Arawai powers, the water safety plan and the threshold that you might need to meet as a rural water supplier is not far from the threshold that as that the new entities will have to deliver. So we're talking, UV. We're talking more than one treatment process for rural water supplies. So I don't want to distract the conversation, but it is important for us recognising that it's different between regulatory and service delivery reform, but this will have an impact on our rural community.
Monique, do we know how many of those 75,000, whatever number they are, actually would land in the Horowhenua? Because, not just today, but in the future, there's going to be continued upwards pressure on that number, I would imagine.
No, and when Brent and I were going through this presentation earlier this afternoon, that was and we don't know them. We don't know who are. So some councils, more recently, they actually use some of their stimulus money from the government to do a piece of work to try and understand, the number. But look, my experience in, we did a project like that in Central Hawke's Bay is right now, they're not going to put their hand up and tell you they are a rural water supplier, because the longer they can stay unregistered, the longer they've got.
This does have implications for us, though, for example, on the rural halls. So we've helped out Marae with grants, and we may need to look at something similar with the rural halls.
Okay, that's good to know, and we can do some work to understand that better.
But certainly in the farming community, where you've got a water supply that is then providing water across the now new boundary to potentially land that's been cut up. I know a number of those that I've come across in Ohau that there's going to be a huge impact there.
Are we ready to move on to the better off funding? So applications opened on the 11th of April and applications close on the 30th of September. Any application must meet the conditions, which I'm going to talk you through soon. All Tranche 1 funds must be spent by the end of June 2027. And there's criteria that they've got to cover, which I'll talk about soon. Councils are expected to consider, when we make our first tranche applications, how that might support funding proposals of the second tranche funding application. And all proposals, I think if I was to underscore kind of anything that the government's looking for, it's a link to measurable wellbeing outcomes.
Sorry, can I just clarify? So is it based on this slide? Is it your understanding that if a council doesn't make the application before 30 September 2022, that the council misses out on it, or that fund, or that those funds are essentially retained in place as part of that broader, that tranche 2 potentially. So it's not a use it or lose it situation.
Yeah, so absolutely, that is my understanding, Councillor Jennings. However, the advice I would provide to Council is that given between the first tranche and the second tranche, we do have a central government election, and the attribution of tranche money is not in legislation. It is a government announcement of the day, and also, we're hearing from other parts of, politics that this reform program might be repealed. I think while you're going to see soon that this is going to be quite a lot of work for the organisation, there is some risk in us not applying. What you said, Councillor Tupapoa. So what's the criteria? So the criteria is to use the funding to support councils to transition to our new role post-reform. And of course, we're not quite sure what our new role is post-reform because we're waiting for the Future for Local Government review, whose second report isn't going to be launched until November, and final report not until March of next year. These are the 3 criteria areas that the government have given us. And proposal needs to meet one of these criteria areas. It doesn't need to meet all 3. So you'll see there, it's about transitioning to a sustainable and low emission economy. Proposals that reflect resilience and climate change or natural hazards would be supported. The delivery of infrastructure and services that enable housing development and growth. And you'll see there with a focus on brownfield and infill development. And then thirdly, the delivery of infrastructure and services that support local placemaking and improvements in community wellbeing. And obviously earlier during the Foxton Pool workshop, I talked about how that definition of placemaking was pretty broad. Under tranche 1, Hurwhenua District Council has been allocated 4.99 million. Tranche 2's the 14.96, so overall it's the 19.95 million. In addition to the outcome, those 3 criteria areas that we have to meet, we have to demonstrate when we submit a proposal to the government 5 prioritisation factors, and so you'll see there around value for money, that's linkage to strategic plans, the quality of our engagement with iwi Māori, risk analysis, and whether the project has community and ratepayer support. And I just wanted to put, I clipped this out of another presentation, but I did just really want to emphasise the iwi Māori engagement piece, because the government have been clear that for the tranche 1 application, they have a minimum expectation that we're what they describe as current state, so that idea you'll see across the continuum of engagement from informed to partner, that that there's at least some conversations and that that there's an informed kind of consult. But certainly for tranche 2, which is the larger amount, there is an expectation that it's essentially a partnership. It's a relationship between iwi and councils when we're making that final application. So just some kind of things where I was maybe expecting some questions. So the funding, taking the funding does not stop council or councillors publicly voicing concerns regarding the reform. We are yet to receive clarity on transitional support funding, and so what I mean by that is Like right now, there's a whole lot of work happening in the business, but we've got a whole lot more work to do if we're going to be prepared for transition. And we are anticipating that there will be some financial support for that, but that remains unclear. And I'm not sure that it will be the amount of funding that we probably need. And kind of there is a whole lot of questions about, not just reform, but also the better off funding. And I just wanted to make the point that if we wait for 100% clarity on some of this stuff, we will run out of time. Some things to kind of note or consider, because I'm going to ask you soon for some advice. What are the transformational push-go, shovel-ready, however we might describe it, projects where that require some co-funding, and is it about leveraging existing things in our long-term plan, or are there some things that we think could be funded itself within this? We do need to be mindful of investments in light of our current Treasury policy position, but also this isn't a case of just sending an email or putting into a table, here's our 5 projects, here's the amount we're going to allocate to them, here government. They don't quite expect a full business case, but there's certainly the need for us to demonstrate some logic mapping or similar pre-work. And so if council is going to give us guidance about something that we've never talked about before or there hasn't been any work done, there is either a feasibility study or a business case or something that we're going to have to prepare in advance of that application for September. We know our current financial reality because we've just adopted our annual plan. But at a detail level, we don't know our new operating model. Ideally, we would be 12 months down the track and we would have our amended long-term plan, but we'd also have a mirrored long-term plan that said, what does life look like post-reform, and what is, we know what that means for debt, for example, but we don't actually understand what it means for all of the, for example, stranded overheads, and therefore what it means for our operating model, and therefore what it might mean for rates. And of course, what's going to be really complex about all of this is you've all ambitiously tonight resolved to review our revenue and financing policy. And when you put a lens across that says, well, we no longer have 3 waters, does that change your perspective around how you see the public-private split on some activities? And of course, the cost to serve some of those activities may change in the absence of the 3 waters service and asset. We've got to ensure that we've got the right capability and capacity in the organisation to respond, not just to the likes of the funding application, but I can't overestimate how much time and work there is needed for us to be in a position of strength going into a transition negotiation with the government, and I'll talk a little bit about that soon when I talk about the National Transition Unit and what's happening there. So again, some things to think about. Obviously you want to make the right decision about creating long-term sustaining benefits for the community. You probably want something tangible out of this. But maybe thinking about, well, who is it we can partner with? Obviously the need for early engagement with Māori. Ideally, I think if I was giving you advice, it would be, can we create something here that's going to create a financial return or ease the financial burden for our community in the long term? And you may want to think about the targeted water rates and how that's reflected in the way you distribute better off funding across the district. So that idea that many communities are contributing to our water rates. It's not just one community. So we don't have heaps of time. This is just a really high level. We're at the start of a conversation with you about the better off funding, and we wanted to get some guidance, but we're going to have to go through a process where you give us some guidance, we can develop a long list, short list, refined short list, we need to think about what that means in terms of engagement, writing of the application. And so probably the point I wanted to make is that I know that the intention is to not have many meetings in July, but we're going to need elected member time if we are going to give this the energy that I think it needs.
Monique, just in the better off payment, I'm going to start off because I know where the conversation's going to go, so I'll just get my position out there, which is that totally opposed to us applying for the better off payment. I think it's a blatant bribe, and I really am uncomfortable about us applying for it. But I know that we don't live in a perfect world, and so also don't want this community to miss out on that tranche of funding if we were to delay. So operate in reality. But where I sit is that if we apply for it, then I think we should be saying that it should be going into essentially a reserve trust type position, perhaps aligned to the blueprint actions, because the blueprint, we've just signed off on it, it's got a series of actions. We've talked about activating parts of it, and we obviously need time to also cost it. And so I think we can, and so this is where I'd be looking for some advice from you, is we've got a blueprint that's already had the high level of analysis, it's had community feedback, it's got clear support from this table, from our stakeholders, partners, been through a robust, open, transparent process. It's got a series of actions that haven't been costed, but if we put up a high level costing of those actions as part of our application for this tranche 1, on the basis of some protections around it being reserve and being put into a reserve state for this purpose, but then that there would be certain things that would follow in terms of actually activating it, whether that would meet the criteria and the expectations of the process. And then the only other thing I'll say is that totally support Councillor Mitchell's proposal around the upgrading the rural and community halls. I think that's a really important component in terms of preparing those facilities for the new regulatory settings. So, yeah.
The only thing I'd add to that is apparently, according to Bill Bailey, is it? Bayfield? Okay. That I think there is money there for rural communities to upgrade. So if that's the case, it would be our job to actually make that happen for the rural halls, for them to get that funding that's available, because they probably haven't got the expertise. We could use our officers to do that for them.
So sorry, just to clarify, so that might be a separate source of funding for that activity, is that? Okay, well that's great to hear.
Yeah, I don't think it's enough to cover New Zealand, though. Councillor Jennings, I was just trying to find the guidance because I think that if the money could go into a reserve fund, every council across New Zealand would have applied for that. But it might be that we can be creative around, like that might be the intention of the council, to not spend it straight away because you want to take the time to get things right, but to utilise the blueprint as the, I suppose, the long list. Yeah, so I wasn't going to come this evening with a whole lot of projects because that's the steer or guidance that we're looking for from this table, so that we can go away and start shaping what this could look like. But what I did kind of attempt to do, rather than provide projects, provide kind of some outcomes you could think about. And I think Councillor Jennings has provided a useful lens of, well, is the blueprint a frame for this? So this is really the point in time where we are needing direction, so that we can start shaping something, because right now we have a blank piece of paper. Thoughts?
The first thing that came to my mind was that there's an awful lot of money going to have to be spent, whether we close it or not, on the landfill. and part of that is the remediation process, and that this might be a very useful contribution to that. I don't know what other people think.
Yeah, I had dump remediation on my list. I wondered whether we should be thinking about our communities where we've done, as well as the blueprint, but our communities where we've done community plans and looked at what their aspirations were and considering, because those plans were well consulted on and were done in partnership at the time with iwi, so whether there's some consideration for what the aspirations of those community plans were. But certainly the dump remediation and live-in town centre upgrade, something aspirational there. But there is, as I understand it, in response, the Climate Emergency Response Fund, $350 million announced for work around the area that this council is looking at for walking and cycling opportunities. So there is money coming available that we should be pouncing on.
I would like to see another whole work stream or trying to think tank it. We've done all that before and it's in the blueprint. And it's probably the freshest document that has set somewhat of a direction. It would be worth our while to select a few of those deliverables, and I think to do them rather quickly, because with the cost escalations, you're going to get the most value out of doing something pretty quickly. Otherwise, inflation will eat away at it. You talk about something tangible for the community, and I think there's an opportunity with the town centre, absolutely, because within this time frame there's going to be some huge pressure on our centre of town with earthquake strength and things, and maybe those conversations can be brought to a decision point where some actions can be actually delivered on to start this, rather than talking about the live-in town centre transformation. Let's actually start doing something. I think that's where my headspace is. I wouldn't support it going to the landfill because that's a decision that I think it needs to stand on its own and carry its own costs through whatever that comes out of that. Because this is a chance to have something which, okay, let's call it we weren't expecting, and get the most value out of it for our people.
Look, yeah, totally support the blueprint as being the guiding document because it's a no-brainer. That's why we adopted it. But there's still some work to be done in terms of the blueprint, the prioritisation process, so that livability, prosperity sort of lens that we're going to look at things through. So for me, the next step is about identifying very clearly what the priorities are within the blueprint. I think a number of us have identified housing as clearly a number one. But I think we need to work through now the prioritisation process, and as I think Bain's mentioned in the past, the monitoring that goes with that. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and so recognising that that's not a piece of work that we can do quickly, unless councillors are prepared to give a whole lot of time in July to do that. I suppose, is there a steer on some priorities?
Housing action plan is number one for me. If we want to make a start tonight.
Yeah, I was going to mention trying to partly talk about partnership, trying with social housing, because there's such a high need, and we're going to fall really far short of what the need is, and there's potential to get beside some of the other delivery agencies in town, whether it be iwi or even beside the, I don't know, some other trust or whatever to develop, because if we don't lead it, it's going to be pretty horrific.
Monique, in terms of, is it worth considering things that are in our long-term plan over the next 5 years and bringing them forward so that we can do? So if we have got issues at the wastewater treatment plant, like we know we have, or is it worth considering things like the reservoir and things like that as well? I would also be keen to see what we could do in terms of stormwater with the lake, because I don't think we've properly assessed that yet. I think the town centre thing is pretty much sort of going to be determined by a decision that's made by Cabinet in a couple of months in terms of how much time we've got to be able to do that. If that could have a different sort of lens in terms of that. So while I think it's a very critical piece of work, I just want to, that would be the. I do agree around some of the community outcomes that we could do, and I'm very conscious of things that discussions we've had in Manukau and places like that where we could actually make quite a bit of difference with a smallish amount of money to what they've been asking for some years in terms of that as well, but also and align with that with the community plans for some of the other areas as well, because that's where my thinking is at the moment.
So that's a really good steer on the community stuff, Mayor Bernie. I think your the idea around the big infrastructure kind of three waters projects, like that is probably something it would be really good to get some clear direction from council on. I suppose my advice, or what I'd encourage council to think about, is do you really want to be investing in three water assets and using your better off funding on three water assets when they are the assets you will no longer own? Or would you rather your better off funding go into assets that you will continue to own in the absence of reform? There are some councils, one council I know of that is investing in three waters, but most are not.
Yeah, I was going to say I wouldn't want to lose that funding into an infrastructure piece, whether it be the wastewater or the reservoir or whatever. But look at some of those projects that have been identified that have had to sit outside the 10 or the 20-year plan because they just couldn't simply fit in within the budget, and maybe consider some of those, bringing those forward. Certainly I'm not thinking in the first tranche because it's only 5 million, but certainly the second tranche.
I'd just be keen to understand from the notes you're making, Monique, about what message you've got in terms of the blueprint priorities. Where I've heard, can we just capture where people are at on that?
So I think that I don't think anyone's disagreed that the blueprint's not a good frame or a lens, but I think what I've heard is some concern that there might not be some projects advanced enough or prioritised enough. The kind of strong theme that's coming out based on those that have spoken is around housing, town centre, community outcomes, placemaking. Like, you haven't used that language, but I'm interpreting it like that. I suppose what's really challenging in these conversations, it's we've got some money that we didn't know we'd have or didn't think we'd have, and we don't necessarily have a prioritisation tool that says, well, council, if you were ever to give, I'm not going to use the word be given, offered some money, how you would make those decisions.
I just reflect on the work that was done with the first tranche of funding, and quite small amounts were used, but made a big difference to a number of people across the district, and have had a really positive outcome. So I'd like to see us thinking about some of those community plans and the aspirations in them, but I still stand beside the fact that I would like us to see, I really do advocate for us doing something around the town centre. I think it's time. I just don't think we can wait forever. I mean, we have to start signalling that change, but I also would like to explore what we could be doing around Hokio and with some of that remediation work that we have been challenged on for many, many years around that issue with the old dump and the stream.
So in terms of the blueprint actions, what I think you've summarised, and which I agree with Monique, is that we're looking at the blueprint actions 1, 2 and 3 and 11. That's how I'm interpreting in terms of the document. This is really important stuff that we need to be clear on. Is that what we're agreeing on here? Yeah. So action, shall I just read them out? So action 1 is enabling more affordable housing choices. Action 2 is attracting more community housing providers. Action 3 is about unlocking land supply. So that's all around the housing issue. And then 11 captures that thing about supporting our communities and centres. So it refers to the Levin Town Centre strategy, the master plan to visualise the implementation of transforming Tautoko, Levin Town Centre, and the Foxton Futures implementation. And I guess within that, community plans may well figure, because that could be a driver for some of those decisions, Joe.
Like, those are very clear kind of priorities and objectives of council, but if we come back to however we might describe it, shovel ready, push go, ready to go, that we don't have a lot of that stuff. Like, we're not ready to go do a housing development or partner with a community housing provider in time to submit an application for August, September. And so we can certainly go away and do the sniff test inside the organisation around, well, what is ready to go inside those 4 priority areas. And you're right, Councillor Tukupa, we don't have to spend it till 2027, but we have to prove to government that we're going to spend the money in a way that's linked to a proposal or a business case, and we can't pull a proposal or business case out of thin air.
So a random thought, things like getting ready for housing and development, is that district plan changes? Like, is that something we could, Well, it's, could we, yeah.
Like, well, they might say that that's BAU. And this, and I understand Councillor Jennings' frustration with this, is that however we describe the money that government is offering this council, we're not just getting it. Like, we have to prove how we're going to use it, and that means that there's quite a bit of work involved to demonstrate how we're going to spend that money wisely.
So basically what you're telling us is pretty much, like reading between the lines, is that it's projects like the Waitangi Surf Life Saving Club building, overspent potentially, like it's top-ups to those projects that are already well advanced that you're suggesting that we focus on. Is that what you're...
Yeah, all projects that, yes, all projects that there is enough detail there that we could, put together a kind of mini plan behind how we were going to achieve that by 2027. And I suspect there'll be some stuff when we go through that blueprint, like take the transforming Tautoko strategy. Like, there'll be some things in there around land acquisition, placemaking initiatives, but there are some things like partnering with a community housing provider and doing a joint venture around building 100 homes in the district. My maths might be a bit out there. I don't know if the 100 homes, but it's very unlikely we're in a position to present a sound proposal to government by the end of August on that.
So, Waitariri Surf Living Saving Club in Foxton Pool done. Just a thought.
So would property purchase qualify? Obviously, on the basis that you would qualify, get the funding, and then you have an asset that you could potentially dispose of at some time in the future in order to fund whatever you wanted to fund, unencumbered by the, I won't use the adjective that I was going to use, this process.
So long as we could demonstrate the community wellbeing outcome, and remember we've got to fit one of those criteria around climate change, around housing development, or around placemaking through community wellbeing. So if we were buying a property to do something, I don't think the intent of this money is for council to get into the business of the wheeling and dealing to enable more money. Even though but look, we can test that. Like I think that tonight's conversation and kind of getting a bit of a signal from elected members gives us some information to go back to Crown Infrastructure Partners and explain, well, this is our situation. These are some projects that could be ready to go versus here's our strategic objectives. We're not quite ready to go, and get some guidance around particularly the reserve fund idea.
So another thing that comes to mind is obviously, I'm not sure what I'm allowed to say this, but in terms of Taraika, there's going to have to be some land purchase there for some specific things in terms of some reserve land. And so if we diverted some of this funding to those projects which are well defined, well articulated, probably reasonably well, we've got a cost in mind, could that then mean that the funding that we have for CRP for use on Taraika could be deployed to other things related to infrastructure to support, like the pot upgrade, okay.
Questions as well.
Just a closing comment. So I'm not against the ideas that have been shared tonight. The blueprint was a good one, but it sounds like it's a not shovel ready type thing. So I'd be interested in funding an activity that has more of a district wide or benefit for as many people as possible. Whilst I like to, what about the town centre and those things? Those things are all good and very necessary, but then it's kind of just for Levin or just for Foxton, and I don't want that. Well, personally, I don't think it should just all get channeled into one particular place. So how you can present it where there's a fair spread, that's kind of more in line with what I'd support.
Donnelly Park upgrade, is that going to fit in within their criteria? Well, it will be. Because there's some, so there's a lot of work done there with the user groups and sort of almost crowd out of the budget. And I think there's a chance to maybe revisit some projects down there, given the wide and varied and the amount of people that in our community that use that facility and will do for generations to come.
What's the new Bang the Table software, and is that something that we as councillors should try out to put in our ideas for how this money is spent? Just a thought. Put our money where our mouth is, because we're asking the public to use it. Should we be using it first?
Oh, as in set up a survey or something of elected members and get your feedback. Look, we can do that. I suppose we were just using a workshop to get that feedback. I'm wondering if from here we kind of take the feedback that we've had to go back to CIP, get some clarity on kind of what's in, what's out, with the view that we are going to have an additional workshop, which is either going to be, if not next Wednesday, the following Wednesday, where we could come back with a long list of options that might have some high level indicative, this is what it could mean, this is the price, and at the risk of this turning into a bit of a kind of grocery shop exercise, a call is going to need to be made. Like we're going to need some narrowing of definition and some narrowing of options so that we can pull together an application. Does that feel like what you want us to do?
Very happy with that, and also, and I'm implicit in that, I'm assuming that there'll be the opportunity for officers to identify maybe some gaps in the conversation tonight, because they will have some very clear, hey, we can get real good bangs for the bucks, you know, if we can input into the conversation too. So, yeah.
Renee, one thing I would value would be for us to go to CIP early and say, this is what we're thinking. This is the best model we think in terms of getting the funding, so that we can get that immediate early feedback from them around why it doesn't work. Because I think we should push the limits, because I think that I find it abhorrent as a taxpayer that we are going to just be spending money for the sake of spending money. It needs to be calculated, targeted, logical, sensible spending. And the best way for us to do that is to give us an appropriate amount of time to do all that kind of assessment. And so this kind of framework just encourages you to rush things, and inevitably you'll probably end up back with a project that's probably underfunded like we have today because of cost escalations, all that kind of stuff. So I think we've got to really push the limits early with them and say, this is what we want to do. This is how we want to deal with this funding. Tell us why this isn't acceptable. So actually sort of be a little bit pushy and a little bit forceful around what's best for our district.
Look, and what I'm wondering is whether we even see whether we can get our relationship manager from Crown Infrastructure Partners and Front of Council, or part of the workshop, because otherwise we just, it just takes more time because all we're doing is relaying information and messages. Yeah. I'm really conscious of time, and we've got a couple of items to follow, and I don't want staff to be here too late. So I'm wondering, because the next slides are all about transition and could actually, just kind of based on the interest, I wonder whether we do part 2 next week or the week after. I'll circulate the slides so that people can do the pre-reading around the transition. And that way we can get through the tornado debrief and the other update around the O2 now. Okay, let's do that.
So that's live stream finished.